important part of that. So I may be focusing on more of the physical health aspects today, but exploring how food plays a role in the mental, emotional health pieces is really key and part of what we talk about within our program. So today I want to share with you a little bit more about intermittent fasting. I guess it's a topic I chose because it's becoming more popular. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you've experimented with it, or you're currently practicing intermittent fasting. But it has become popular in more recent years, kind of riding the coattails of the ketogenic diet, which has certainly become popularized both therapeutically and from more of a fad diet standpoint. But there is some overlap that happens with intermittent fasting and the ketogenic diet, which I think part of the reason why it's become really popular. So I want to just give a little bit of an overview on what intermittent fasting is, how it can be implemented, and talk about some of the physiological health effects associated with it. So really, intermittent fasting is defined by a way of eating that alternates between periods of fasting and periods of eating. Well, this is important because food is fuel. It's a language that the body speaks. And not only what we feed ourselves, but now we're learning when we feed ourselves can be really impactful. And that's partially what I want to talk about today around this idea of consuming foods certain times of the day because it may actually help support physiological processes. So, as I just mentioned, intermittent fasting is a way of eating that alternates between periods of fasting and eating. Sometimes it's referred to as time-restricted fasting. And I say here it's less about what you eat and about when you eat, which is true when we're talking about intermittent fasting as a definition. But I will say that it is extremely important to also consider what you eat in the periods that you are eating. It's not to say that you can fast for 16 or 20 hours a day and then just go eat whatever you want because you've fasted for an extended period. You should really still focus on a healthful, nutrient-dense diet. Is really key. Now, some people pair intermittent fasting with a ketogenic diet because they want to experience the advantages and the health benefits of ketosis, but you don't necessarily have to pair it with a ketogenic diet, which is consuming extremely high fat and restricting carbohydrates. Usually people are fasting for periods of 16 to upwards of 48 hours is what they're looking at. I would say typically it's that 16-hour period that people are really focused on. So this is a pretty common method that people are using. They're restricting food intake for 8 hours a day. And this is sometimes referred to as the 16-8 method. So they're fasting for 16 hours, feeding during an 8-hour period. Some people extend that out. Some people do 18 hours of fasting or 20 hours of fasting and just shorten that window of time. There are some advantages to that. We now know through research that physiologically there are some advantages to that additional time. But think about just in your own life when you are eating meals, snacking, and things throughout the day. We are usually fasting every day. We eat our last meal at a certain point in the evening time, and we don't eat again till sometime the next day. Sometimes it's morning, sometimes it's not till lunchtime. Certainly each person it's gonna depend on certain circumstances, but we are having an extended fast. Think about the word breakfast. If you break that word apart, that's exactly what it means. You are breaking the fast because you've been fasting from the night before. If we extend that out just a little bit longer, we can have some improved physiological advantages from a long-term health standpoint, short-term, but also long-term health standpoint. There are other approaches to intermittent fasting that include restriction of calories every other day. Some people will fast every other day, or some people are doing more of a calorie restriction just a few days a week, more significant or severe calorie restriction 2 days a week, and this is referred to as the 5-2 method. There are multiple ways that you can implement intermittent fasting. You may read about it on websites, you may read about it in research. and different ways that is presented. But ultimately, we're talking about an extended period without food, because we know that that can have differences in metabolic function. This is picture here is just to give you an indication. If we are looking at kind of that 16-8 method, in the red, what we're looking at is with the consumption of food. I don't really necessarily want to focus on the fat storage versus fat burning. However, with food consumption, we are usually seeing an increased spike of insulin, specifically if we're consuming some type of carbohydrate. And when we are not consuming food, we tend to decrease our insulin levels, and also tends to decrease inflammation in the body, which can be advantageous for a number of different reasons. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the physiological effects that can occur as a result of this. So what ties into kind of what's happening behind the scenes, if you will, when it comes to intermittent fasting, is stimulating the process of ketosis. Now, ketosis is the body's ability to produce energy from fats. In a time of fasting, we are relying upon the body's own store of fat from our adipose tissue. If we are on a ketogenic diet, we are relying upon our own adipose tissue stores, but also the high fat that we're consuming from the foods within that diet as it's recommended. This occurs during extended periods of glucose restriction. So the body likes to burn glucose, sugar, for energy. That's how it is adapted as its primary energy and fuel source. However, we can adapt through times of fasting or on a ketogenic diet to shift our metabolism to rely upon fats for energy. So we can break down fatty acids, whether it comes from our own stores in our adipose tissue or from the diet. So in fasting, in intermittent fasting, what they have found is that people start to release fats from their own stores, from their adipose tissue, at about the 12-hour mark. So if I had dinner at 6 p.m. last night and I didn't eat until 6 a.m. this morning, or 8 a.m. or 10 a.m., I'm going to start after that 6 a.m. mark. I'm going to start actually burning or breaking down some of the fats from my adipose tissue and utilizing that for ATP production. So in essence, depending again on your own timing of meals, you might be actually experiencing extended fasting and a little bit of ketosis on a daily basis. From a physiological effect, we now know that research has indicated there are a number of areas where intermittent fasting and ketones can be beneficial for long-term health. Now, I'll give you a minute to just kind of look at this. Some of it may make sense, some of it may not make sense, and that's okay. What I want to point out is that there are a number of areas, including cognitive health, cardiovascular health, musculoskeletal health, as well as gastrointestinal health, where we actually see benefits associated with intermittent fasting. And there's a couple of reasons why. Really, what research has identified is there's three kind of big key areas that are impacted when it comes to fasting. One is stimulating a process called autophagy. You may have heard of this before. Autophagy is a process where the body has its natural inherent abilities through organelles within cells that can work to actually upregulate and clean the cells, clean them of cellular debris, to reduce the risk of oxidative stress. Oxidative stress and inflammation are two big drivers of chronic disease, and things like certainly implicated in things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, but even conditions like cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. So if we can stimulate the process of autophagy, where we actually give the body a break through fasting and can upregulate cellular mechanisms where the body can allow to repair itself and regenerate tissue, can be really, really key and really important. Another area of importance that research has identified with fasting is mitochondrial health. Mitochondria are important, oftentimes cellular organelles, oftentimes referred to as the powerhouse of the cell, where most energy is produced. But we also know that when metabolism is ramped up, oftentimes from overnutrition or overeating, because we need to burn the fuel that we're consuming, it can lead to oxidative stress and inflammation, and it can lead to early cell death as a result. So fasting actually gives our mitochondria a break. It gives it a pause, right? Just like driving a car, you have to put fuel in your car, you drive it around, but you're not, unless you're on a road trip or you're a truck driver, you're not constantly driving your car. You don't put gas in it and then drive it until it's empty. You might drive it home and take a break, and the next day go to work or go to school, and then come home, and then maybe you have to run out to the grocery store or whatever it might be. But it's the same type of idea where we're not constantly burning fuel. We're giving ourselves a break. When we give the body a break, when we give our mitochondria a break, it allows itself to repair and regenerate. So we're not overstressing it. The other area that's really emerged in this that is of interest is around the gut microflora. Now, we know more and more about the importance of the gut microbiota for health, but when it comes to intermittent fasting, it's been shown that giving our microflora a break from food actually helps support the populations of gut microbes that exist within the intestinal tract. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, because part of it relates to our circadian rhythm, which is really quite cool. So we know that circadian rhythm, the body's different processes that occur throughout a 24-hour cycle, are regulated by two main areas: kind of our central circadian clock, which is in our brain and is primarily operating through light and dark cycles, and release of things like melatonin are really important. But there are also peripheral circadian clocks that can be influenced through the foods that we eat, actually, which is really quite fascinating. So what they have found through intermittent fasting, which supports our gut microflora, it can actually have an influence on our central and our peripheral circadian clocks, which regulate normal metabolic processes that happen throughout a 24-hour time period. So as much as we talk about the importance of sleep for overall health, actually looking at the timing of when we eat foods can actually be really important for health as well. And so research has now identified these areas. And of course, our lifestyle factors are important too. So it's not just about, as I mentioned earlier, the fasting and the timing of what we eat, but when we eat. Certainly sleep is really important, make sure that we're having healthy sleep patterns, as well as regular activity and physical exercise. So it's multifactorial, and that's how life is, right? We're dynamic humans. We're not simplistic beings by any means. Even though I might talk about it simplistically, it is complex. But the relationship between the intestinal microbiota and how it can help regulate the circadian clocks is really quite fascinating. And as a result of managing and ensuring that our circadian clocks are within healthy rhythm, it results in healthy hormonal responses, including things like insulin, sex hormones, but also proper immune system response and helping regulating inflammation, and also relationships between things like cholesterol levels. And at the end of the day, they're now looking at this in context of chronic preventable disease. So it's really quite interesting stuff. And again, this just kind of outlines in a different way, but with intermittent fasting, the availability of nutrients, the foods that we consume, can have a shift or an impact on our gut microflora. And what they are looking at is not only can the composition and the diversity of the microbes influence signaling involved with our circadian rhythms, because they have now identified certain populations of gut microbes involved in the cycling or disruption of cycling, but also the metabolites here on the bottom, the metabolites or the byproducts of what those microbes produce as a result of what we feed them, can have an influence on signaling these peripheral and central circadian clocks. So research is really starting to dive into this. It's quite cool. And as a part of our program, that's what I'm excited about, is we're constantly looking at the research and trying to better understand how food and nutrition is playing a role in health. It's really, really fascinating and interesting stuff. We can't sit on the sidelines and just read from a textbook anymore. Well, that information is valuable. Textbooks sometimes are outdated, and we have to look to the latest research that's coming out. and exploring some of this. So looking at it in kind of a different model, and again, there's a lot of information here, so I'll just kind of give you some minutes to look through this as I'm talking, but really what we're looking at is the circadian rhythm that occurs and how on the left-hand side, our waking hours and our feeding hours influence circadian rhythm, as well as our sleeping or our fasting hours. And we know that through fasting, and kind of following that normal cycle, even extending fasting into the early hours of the day and even upwards towards noon can be beneficial for stimulating certain biochemical processes that can have an impact on cardiovascular health, that can have an impact on cognitive health, and overall metabolic function, reducing risk of preventable chronic diseases. So it's really kind of intertwined in how we look at these things, and it's not always just an A plus B equals C. There's oftentimes multiple dots and connections and more of a web-like configuration when we have to take a look at how foods and diet play a role in influencing human health. And just to summarize some of this information, research has indicated a multitude of potential health benefits associated with intermittent fasting. Now, intermittent fasting, and again, this is not an all-inclusive list, I should say. This is just some areas that research has started to emerge. We know that it's beneficial. We know that it's not for everyone either. That's the other thing. It's not for everyone, and there are some people that may be impacted more significantly by it. So certainly if anyone is considering it, usually we're recommending that there's a kind of slow approach to it. So not just waking up one day and doing it, but actually starting out and saying, okay, here's where I normally eat my last meal of the day. And if I calculate that out to 16 hours or 18 hours, whatever you're looking at, maybe I don't go for 16 hours the first day. Maybe I aim for 12 or 14 and see how I feel. Some people might end up having hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. That can cause things like hunger and irritability. For those of you that have seen the Snickers commercials on TV before, and they're making fun of, kind of the being hangry feeling, that's true. Those are true phenomenons. The body's kind of natural response when our blood sugar gets low is to not only do we signal hunger cues, but we become irritable. That's kind of our primordial response to low blood sugar in trying to secure food so that our blood sugar can come back up into a range that is going to help support our functioning that's happening in that moment. But some people may experience these, and some people may need to kind of ease their way into intermittent fasting. Very rarely would I ever suggest to someone, don't eat after 6 p.m. and wake up the next day and don't eat till noon. Some people might be able to do that and not have issues, but some people it may be more of a challenge. So as much as there is tied into this, the physical symptoms, it's also that irritability and the mental emotional side that comes with it. And it's an opportunity to teach people how to work on listening to their own body and listening to their own hunger cues. And it's conversations where we can talk about intuitive eating and mindfulness. And that's also a learned behavior that not many people know how to manage. And so it's something that we have to teach people. There are also people that we wouldn't want to recommend intermittent fasting for that I have listed out here. Certainly women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, individuals with a history or risk of eating disorder, advanced liver disease, advanced kidney disease, or hyperthyroidism are specific areas that we wouldn't recommend intermittent fasting. But for the most part, for most people, intermittent fasting is safe. It doesn't put them at risk typically of any sort of health-related issues other than the kind of acute hunger and irritability symptoms that I mentioned just a minute ago. Fasting has been around for millennia and has been practiced by religions and cultures for a long time and has been done safely. And so it's something that should be considered as a therapeutic approach to supporting folks that may benefit from it. And it's something for us to just kind of consider in our own lives to think about our own relationship to food and our own connection to meal times and eating and all these types of things, because that when we eat can actually have an impact on our circadian rhythm. Many people don't realize that, that it's not just about when I go to bed at night and when I wake up in the morning and my overall sleep health, but it also has a relationship to our timing of our foods throughout the day and how we can support our circadian rhythm and support our overall health. So with that, are there any questions? I know I kind of zipped through that quickly, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to open it up for any questions relative to this or anything you might have about nutrition programming at NUNM.